and the first exam is now going to be given 1 week from today. So the plan is to finish up chapter 3 in the first half of the class period today. And then I'm going to introduce chapter 5 with a video that I have for you guys. And then I'm going to do my lecture on chapter 5 on Monday. And then we will have our first exam on Wednesday. So the plan is to not have a class meeting next Wednesday, and your assignment will be to take the first exam. Okay, so let's just go ahead and jump back in to chapter 3 where we left off. So I think the topic that we last explored was sleep, which makes sense given that the topic of our chapter is consciousness. And I apologize in advance if I sound a little hoarse this morning. My allergies have been bugging me, and I'm 90% sure it's not COVID. But because my oxygen saturation, actually, my Fitbit is charging, so I can't see it right now. But when I looked earlier, my oxygen saturation was 95%. So that's pretty good. I don't think my oxygen saturation would be that high if I had COVID-19. So, but who knows? I'm not a doctor, right? I could be asymptomatic. I might not know what the hell I'm talking about, but I'm pretty sure it's just allergies. Okay, so let's continue chapter 3 at this point. The rest of the chapter deals with states of consciousness, altered states of consciousness other than sleep. And we don't normally think of sleep as an altered state of consciousness, but it is. It's a state of consciousness that is quite different from our normal waking consciousness. But sleep is not the only altered state of consciousness that we encounter in life. So the remainder of the chapter is devoted to exploring other types of altered states, as we call them. And when we talk about altered states of consciousness, we're just talking about states of consciousness in which your experience of consciousness is significantly different from how it normally is. So that's very vague, but either there's a change in the way we think about things, or there's a change in our perception of our sense of self, or our perception of the world, etc., right? So the first altered state of consciousness that I want to talk a little bit about is hypnotic suggestion, also known as hypnosis. There's a lot of murky cloudiness and misconceptions that need to be cleared up about what hypnosis actually is and how it actually affects people. Just to get it right out of the way, 90% of what you see, if not 100% of what you see on TV or out of Hollywood, portrayals of hypnosis are pretty much BS. You know, there's not a lot of accuracy to the way that hypnosis is presented in the media. For one thing, you know, if you've ever seen the movie Zoolander, you know, you could see a rather humorous example of this. Does anybody remember what happened to poor Derek Zoolander in the first Zoolander movie with hypnosis? He gets hypnotized and he becomes this poor schmuck who gets hypnotized and becomes the unwitting patsy who attempts to assassinate the president of Malaysia. So, you know, there's this cue that he's hypnotized to learn, so that when he hears the song Relax by Frankie Goes to Hollywood, it automatically cues him to try to kill the president of what was it, Malaysia or something? I can't even remember, right? But at a fashion show, right? Along with his dim-witted sidekick played by Owen Wilson. And it's quite a hilarious film, and it's one of my favorite, actually one of my favorite movies by that actor whose name is Ben Stiller. Yes, it's one of my favorite Ben Stiller movies, but and also one of my favorite Will Ferrell movies too. But despite the fact that I find the movie hilarious, I must confess that the portrayal of hypnosis in that movie and in most other Hollywood films is quite lacking in its scientific accuracy. in reality, when someone is hypnotized, they're not going to be entering this mental state where they're going to be hopelessly compelled to do whatever you tell them, right? That's not how it works. I've been hypnotized before with a real bona fide psychologist who's trained in hypnotherapy. I got to have the experience. It was pretty cool. And it turns out that I'm one of the folks who are more hypnotizable. It turns out that when you look at the actual real scientific research on real hypnosis, that people vary on what we call hypnotizability. So some people are highly hypnotizable, some people are moderately hypnotizable, other people are not hypnotizable at all, right? Some people just can't be hypnotized. It's just not the way they're wired. So first off, there are people who are more hypnotizable than others. And on a scale of 1 to 10, you know, I would probably put my hypnotizability somewhere around a 6 or a 7, right? So I'm pretty moderately hypnotizable, I've found out, which makes sense because I'm also, now when I say good at, that's a really loaded thing to say, which I kind of don't even want to say, but I am kind of good at, so to speak, meditation, right? I've been practicing meditation for over 10 years, and for the last 2 or 3 years, I've done it on a daily basis. It's the first thing I do when I wake up. I sit for 20 to 30 minutes, and on days when I don't get the chance to meditate because I've slept in or something, or I've had some sort of disturbance, I know, I mean, I feel it. It's, you know, it definitely makes a difference in my day. And I'll talk more about meditation in a second. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I think there's a correlation between being good at meditating and being hypnotizable. And that's just my hypothesis. You know, I don't know what the research says on that, but I think there's a correlation there because I'm pretty moderately good at meditation, about, you know, getting myself into a relaxed meditative state through verbal guided meditations. And I'm also moderately hypnotizable. And my experience of hypnosis, quite honestly, was an experience of just mental relaxation. Never at any point was I under the control of the hypnotherapist. You know, if the hypnotherapist would have told me, you know, to go try to assassinate the leader of some country, I probably would have just started laughing, right? You know, there was no point at which, you know, I was under the control of anyone, right? It was just a relaxed mental state where I was more open to ideas and, you know, just felt more open and creative, and, you know, I felt like I had more control over my mind, right? Basically, it felt a lot like a verbally guided meditation for me. And quite honestly, my experience of hypnosis has been quite similar to the experience that I've had when I've been in with a session with a meditation teacher and have done a guided, you know, I've studied meditation under a few teachers, and, you know, both recorded and in person, right? And the experience that I have during hypnosis, and it's been a few years since I've been hypnotized, but the experiences that I've had while hypnotized, and I've done 2 sessions, were almost indistinguishable for me from the experiences that I've had while doing verbally guided meditations. Very similar. But that was just my experience. Has anybody here, other than myself, ever experienced a bona fide hypnosis session with a real legit hypnotherapist? I'm not talking a stage hypnotist, which is BS, by the way. I'm talking like a real trained. Anybody have that experience? It's a neat experience if you ever get the chance to do it. The person that hypnotized me, by the way, she's still a local psychotherapist here in town still to this day. She still practices, and she's very good at hypnosis. If there's anybody in town who can get you hypnotized, if you're a person who is hypnotizable, I highly recommend Carol Hicks. She's very good at hypnosis. And if you are a hypnotizable person, she can get you hypnotized, and it's a cool experience to have. And she practices out of her home over in East Hill. Her name is Carol Hicks, and she's not cheap though. I think she probably charges like 150 or 200 bucks an hour, but it's, you know, so it's not something that most people can afford to do. I had the cool experience of getting to do it for free because it was related to, you know, something that I was doing in graduate school. So, you know, I normally can't afford that either myself. I'm a teacher. So, okay. So that's hypnosis. And sometimes it can be used to help people quit smoking or, change bad habits, exercise more often, eat less junk food, you know, whatever it is that whatever behavior pattern that you're trying to improve. There's some evidence that for some people, hypnotherapy might be a helpful way of, a helpful tool in the toolkit for changing behavior patterns and that sort of thing. And not because you're under the control of the person hypnotizing you, just because you become a little bit more open to ideas and you become a little bit more in touch with your own mind through the hypnotic process, which is very similar to meditation, at least for me. So the two predominant theories that your textbook presents on hypnosis are the sociocognitive theory of hypnosis and the dissociation theory. The sociocognitive theory of hypnosis, I think, does a good job of explaining stage hypnotists, right? The sort of stuff that you see in Hollywood portrayals. For example, when my wife and I were undergraduate students at UWF, when dinosaurs walked the earth back in 2005, when we met, actually. But when dinosaurs walked the earth, when my wife and I were working on our bachelor's degrees in psychology and started dating in college, it's kind of a cute story, but for another day. But when we started dating in college, during that time at UWF, she lived on campus in the dorms, and I lived off campus with my grandma. But in any case, we went on a date one night, which was there was a stage hypnotist that had come to campus at UWF. Student activities had brought this stage hypnotist, and we went and attended. And of course, my wife was the prettiest, loudest girl in the audience, in just my humble opinion, right? But she stood out for whatever reason to the stage hypnotist, and she got picked as a volunteer to come up on stage and get hypnotized, right? And so in any case, she's on stage, and she's mooing like a cow and doing various ridiculous things at the stage hypnotist's command, and I'm laughing my ass off, right? And because I know it's all BS, right? So she gets off the stage, and the show is over, and I'm like, "Well, sweetie, you're a really good sport, right? I mean, you could have ruined his show for him, right? You did a great job of going along with that." And she's like, "I know, right?" She's like I'm going to ruin the show, right? But she just totally acknowledged that she was just going along, to make everybody in the crowd happy and to keep the stage hypnotist happy, right? It was the social demands of the situation. There was no point during that evening in which my wife was under, or my girlfriend at the time, but there was no point at which Sarah was under the control of the hypnotist, right? Never at any point, right? She was just, and she'll totally tell you this, by the way. She was just going along, to make a good show, right? Basically, she was responding to the social pressures of the situation, basically. And that is basically what sociocognitive hypnosis says, that basically, at least a lot of the time, and they might even argue all of the time, I don't know if I would go that far, but this theory basically says that when people are hypnotized, they're just behaving according to social expectations. Now, the dissociation theory fits more with my own personal experiences in hypnosis, where you actually enter this altered state of consciousness, which was the experience that I had. I did enter an altered state of consciousness through hypnosis, but again, never at any point did I feel that I was under the control, so to speak, of the hypnotherapist. All right, so that's all I have on hypnosis. Any thoughts or comments on hypnosis? Okay, so the next altered state of consciousness that I want to discuss is that of meditation, which I've talked a little bit already. So meditation is considered what psychologists call a contemplative practice. This is a general term. When we say contemplative, a lot of people think necessarily religious or spiritual. And that is true for many people. For millions, if not billions of people in the world, particularly Hindus and Buddhists in particular, I'm thinking of, meditation is part of their religious practice and their religious worldview. And it is considered a sacred practice, just like a Muslim praying to Mecca, or or a Christian saying the Lord's Prayer before bed, right? So to Hindus and Buddhists the world over, meditation is indeed a religious practice. And I think that this introduces some degree of confusion, and it causes some folks to think that it causes some people to think that meditation is necessarily a religious practice, that you necessarily have to be a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Taoist, or there are a number of Eastern religions where religion is part of the practice. Where meditation is part of the practice. So this creates this confusion among a lot of folks, I think, in the West, who think that in order to practice meditation, you have to believe in the beliefs of Buddhism or the beliefs of Hinduism. Like you have to believe in reincarnation or past lives, or you have to worship the Buddha or something. And by the way, the Buddha never considered himself a god. That's a common misconception among folks who've never studied Buddhism. The Buddha never once referred to himself as a god. He saw himself as a human being, as a teacher, nothing more. So that's something interesting to note. It was his followers who deified him after he died, who began to view him as a god. But he never saw himself as a deity, not once, and never referred to himself as such, by the way. But in any case, there's this misconception that you've got to be a Buddhist or a Hindu or a Taoist, etc., to practice meditation. And there's also this misconception that if you're a Christian, which, by the way, I would loosely consider myself a Christian. I don't know if I would fit the definition of Christian traditionally that most people would give, but I loosely still consider myself a Christian. But I am also an ardent, or at least try to be a disciplined practitioner of meditation as well. And I experience no conflict between my personal Christian faith and my meditation practice. Now, other Christians don't want to have anything to do with meditation because they see it as a pagan religious practice, and they're going to get possessed by demons or something if they do it, right? But that's just ignorance. So there's no conflict, if you're a Muslim or a Christian, or even if you're an atheist or an agnostic, which I identified as an agnostic for many, many, many years before I actually started to embrace a more adult, mature version of my childhood Christian faith in recent years. But that's neither here nor there. My point is that it doesn't matter if you're a Buddhist, a Hindu, Christian, atheist, Muslim, agnostic, whatever, spiritual but not religious, whatever term you want to use. Meditation practice, ultimately, the point of it is to have a better understanding of your own mind and to increase your self-control over your own mind. Mastery over your emotions, discipline, mental training is what meditation is all about. It has nothing to do with religious faith, ultimately, unless you make it about religious faith. Ultimately, meditation in its purest form is about learning to discipline your mind and gaining control over your emotions and not being so quick to react all the time the way most people are. Have you ever noticed just how quick most people are to react without thinking, right? A regular meditation practice can give you some distance between your behavior and your emotions. And it can give you that little extra 5 seconds that it buys you to say, whoa, wait, I don't want to say that. I don't actually want to post this status on Facebook. I don't want to make this comment on this Pensacola News Journal article on Facebook because It's just going to start an argument, and it's going to raise my blood pressure, and it's going to change nobody's mind, right? So once you start to meditate, you start to see these habits, right? These mental habits and these behavioral habits, and you start to see yourself more in a detached way, like an outside observer. And it gives you the opportunity to have more mastery over your thoughts and behaviors and your own mind. And to me, that's ultimately what meditation is all about, and that's why I do it. Now, the two types of meditation that I practice regularly are concentration meditation and mindfulness meditation, which are the first two that are listed here. I can't really say much about TM. Transcendental meditation was a form of meditation practice that kind of was founded in the late 1800s by the famous poets of that era, like Walt Whitman, Henry David Thoreau, later Robert Bly. But some of these famous, what we call the transcendentalist poets, I don't know if you guys are familiar with them, but the transcendentalist poets of the late 1800s, mostly associated with Walt Whitman and Henry David Thoreau, and Ralph Waldo Emerson was the other one I was thinking of. These folks, these poets kind of popularized this in the late 1800s, and it's still popular, and I know people that swear by it. And the reason why I don't know much about it, though, is it's transcendental meditation is trademarked. And, it's very difficult to find YouTube videos on it that are free, that are quality. To find a decent TM teacher, they charge a lot of money, right? And, to go through like a bona fide TM class with a certified TM teacher, I've heard that you can pay up to $1,000 just, and I don't got that kind of money, and maybe you do, but you're a Pensacola State College student, so I'm betting that like me, you probably don't have that kind of money either. But in any case, so I don't know a lot about TM, so I can't really say much about it, but I do have quite a bit of experience with concentration and mindfulness. Concentration meditation is a form of meditation that is aimed at focusing on one object for a prolonged period of time. And through this, you can achieve states of consciousness that I can only describe as extremely relaxed. I've had out-of-body experiences actually during concentration meditation, believe it or not, where I've had the sensation of leaving my body. It's only happened to me once or twice, and I've been practicing meditation for, like I said, over 10 years. But I've had a handful of really intense, most of the really intense experiences that I've had during meditation have actually been through concentration meditation. And it makes sense because you're intensely focusing on one object for half an hour, for an hour, for 2 hours. And once you start to focus in on this one thing for a prolonged period of time, it does things to your brain. And you start to enter this mental state that really, you have to experience it. It can't really be described. Is it scary? Joshua says. It hasn't been for me. Some folks who aren't prepared for this do have, I've heard from other folks who have had experiences meditating that have frightened them. It's never happened to me because I'm kind of fascinated. I'm very open to experience, and I kind of seek these experiences out a little bit. I'm kind of I'm a little bit of a meditation junkie myself, and I love these sorts of experiences. But for some folks who've never experienced anything like this, who aren't prepared for it, you can have some really intense, like out-of-body sorts of experiences. Like I've said, some folks have the experience that their self temporarily dissolves and they become one with the universe. I mean, I've heard some far out stuff. And for those who aren't prepared for it, I've heard that some people can be freaked out by it. Yeah. Now, I find it fascinating when these things happen. It's just kind of like a trip, right? But other folks, it kind of freaks them out. And yeah, so it's not unheard of. So Lily asked, so like put an apple in front. Yeah, you could use an apple. Using a visual object is, in my opinion, a little advanced for a beginner. Almost universally, most beginners are encouraged by a good meditation teacher. And there are a lot of good apps out there, by the way, if you're really interested in taking up a practice. I use the Waking Up app, which was put together by Sam Harris, who is a famous neuroscientist, and he's also a meditation teacher, and he's written a lot of best-selling books. He's a little bit of a controversial dude in some areas, and he's also well known as being like one of the world's most militant atheists, right? So, like I said, it doesn't matter what your religious background is. You can practice meditation. Sam Harris is a hardcore atheist, and I love his meditation app, right? I consider myself loosely a Christian, and I practice meditation, right? So again, this just illustrates, you can be atheist, Christian, Muslim, meditation is fundamentally a religiously neutral practice, is my point. But in any case, I use the Waking Up app. There's another really well-known one called Calm, which a lot of folks like. If you just Google the top meditation apps, you'll probably get a nice big list of articles where different meditation apps have been reviewed. I mean, just do your research. But I would say, starting off with a visual, back to the Apple example, a visual object is a little bit advanced for a beginner, in my professional opinion. Now, I'm not a professional meditation teacher. I've thought about doing it, but I just don't consider myself advanced enough. Even though I've been practicing for over 10 years, I still consider myself a beginner, believe it or not. And maybe I'm understating myself a little bit, but I think it's good to stay humble. But there's a lot of good apps out there. Most teachers are going to start you off with, if you're doing concentration meditation, they're going to start you off with your breath. And it probably, at least for the first year of your practice, typically, and maybe sooner they'll move you to a visual object or an auditory object. But most teachers will start you off by focusing on the breath for concentration. Joshua Payne, you saw some flashy lights. Yeah, I mean, people sometimes will have these visual experiences. I mean, I've heard of that. That's not uncommon. My advice is to just view these experiences. If you're going to stick with the practice, if it freaks you out too much, then don't. I'm not pressuring anybody to do anything. But to just see these experiences as like waves on the ocean that come and go. They're just products of brain activity that come and go during consciousness. They rise and fall, they come and go, and just watch them like leaves floating by in a stream. You're sitting on top of a little bridge over a stream, and you're just watching your thoughts and experiences go by like leaves on a stream. They come and go, right? And that's the way that I approach. I will occasionally have some disconcerting, sorts of experiences during meditation, and when they arise, I just treat them that way, and they just rise and fall like waves on the ocean. They come and go. That's my approach. Now, mindfulness meditation is sort of a little bit of the flip of concentration. With concentration meditation, you're focusing intensely on one object for a prolonged period of time. Like I said, and typically you'd start off with the breath. More advanced practitioners would move on maybe to an auditory object, which we call a mantra, or maybe a visual object. So you would keep your eyes open in that case and stare at an object. Maybe it could be the image of Christ or the Buddha or the Prophet Muhammad, whatever it is that your object of devotion is, right? You could incorporate your religious faith into it if you wanted to. And a lot of folks for visual concentration meditations will do just that. They'll pick an object of faith devotion that represents that object of faith, and they'll use that as their visual object. Now, some Christians or Muslims might see that as idolatry, right? So, that just depends on what your religious beliefs around iconography are. But in any case, mindfulness meditation is a form of meditation that, instead of focusing on one object, the goal is to open up your awareness to as many facets of your experience at once as possible. So instead of narrowly focusing on one thing, You're opening up your awareness so that you're aware of as much as possible at once, right? So how much can you be aware of at once, basically? And not just aware of, but non-judgmentally aware, right? So when you're mindfully aware of something, you're not trying to change what's happening. You're not judging what's happening as good or bad. You're just seeing it all as phenomena that just rises and falls and comes and goes. And it's just, you're not identifying with any of it. You're just watching it all come and go in a non-identifying sort of way. And through this practice of mindfulness, it allows you to learn to put some space between yourself and your emotions. You learn that you are not your emotions. You are not your memories. You are not your thoughts. In fact, the harder you try to find yourself through mindfulness meditation, the more and more you see that there is no real solid self at all, right? This sense of solidity that we experience, this sense of self that we experience as this unchanging static entity, it's actually constantly changing. Our beliefs are constantly changing. Our way of viewing the world is constantly changing. The way we see ourselves is constantly changing. Our emotions are constantly changing. There is no solid self to be found in all of those constantly changing things, right? So you just start to see it all as like a stream of just constantly changing consciousness, right? And it really can radically shift the way you look at your own emotions and your own thoughts, and you really start to identify with them much less, which can be a really healthy thing, by the way. Okay, so that's about all I have to say about meditation. Josh shared some experiences. Has anyone else had any experiences, positive or negative, with meditation? Any experiences at all? Again, it's it's not a panacea. I speak passionately when I speak about meditation, but taking up a meditation practice, it's not going to cure your diabetes. It's not going to make you lose weight by itself, right? Now, it might make you more mindful of the habits that you're engaged in that are keeping you heavier, right? If you're worried about your weight. It'll make you more aware of the things that you need to change, right? But taking up a meditation practice is not going to fix all of your problems by itself. So I caution folks into going into a meditation practice thinking that it's going to be this panacea, and if you take up a meditation practice, suddenly you're going to become this wise sage who's never stressed out, and the dude abides, right? And you're just, you're going to be just totally cool with everything from now on, and nothing's ever going to stress you out, and you're never going to give another rude, thoughtful comment to another person ever again, and you're going to become this saintly Mother Teresa or Buddha-like figure. No. That takes years and years and years of practice. And now what will happen to you, though, is if you're disciplined, is, again, you will start to get a little bit of space between your behavior and your emotions, and you will start to identify with these things less and less the more disciplined you become in your practice. So the shift that happens is slow and subtle. But eventually, at some point, people will start to notice, and you'll start to get little comments here and there like, something's changed about you, right? I don't know what it is, man, but something's changed. You just seem a little more put together these days, right? You seem a little less fazed by things. People will slowly start to notice. Now, that's not the reason why you do it, to get accolades, right? But there will be a genuine shift that will happen slowly over time. But for most folks, it's not this sudden spiritual transformation that happens overnight, right? Like any practice, like bodybuilding, like martial arts, like intellectual development, like any other project of self-improvement, it takes time, it takes discipline and effort. And, your efforts start to snowball over time, right? It's like compound interest. Okay. Okay, so the next altered state of consciousness I want to talk a little bit about for a second is the flow state. And I'm about running out of time. or chapter 3. I need to be getting into chapter 5 here soon because we're getting into the second half of the class period. So I'm just going to kind of flow through the rest of this. All right, kind of fly through the rest of it, actually. All right, but in any case, the flow state is an altered state of consciousness that many of us will experience at some point in our life. It's usually by accident when we get totally absorbed in a task. It often happens to athletes and performers, right? So I'm talking musicians, I'm talking ballet dancers, I'm talking athletes, or it could even happen to you while you're studying, actually. But anytime you're engaged in a task and you become completely absorbed in that task and time stops and wow, you're like, holy crap, I've been doing this for 4 hours and it feels like 5 minutes has gone by, right? Because you've been totally absorbed in what you're doing in a sort of positive sort of way, right? So your sense of self kind of disappears for a while. Your self-consciousness disappears. Time kind of disappears and you become completely absorbed. You know, you are the guitar. You know, if you are a ballet dancer, you are the floor that you're standing on, right? There's no separation between the dance and you, right? If you're playing basketball, you are the net, you are the basket, you are the ball, right? And there is no there is no division between self and what you're doing, and you just become completely engrossed, right? And it's one of the most rewarding experiences one can have in life, right? And it tends to happen when we get completely absorbed doing something that we're good at and doing something that we love, right? Has anybody ever had this experience? If you pay attention to your conscious experience, next time you're doing something that you love for a prolonged period of time, you might just find yourself in a flow state. Can anybody think of any flow experiences that they've had? Okay. When you're playing piano, yeah, I could definitely do it. Just, you know, you are the song you're playing, right? And you're not even really thinking about the notes at all. There is no thought. Everything is just happening on its own, basically, without effort. When soul paints, yeah. And by the way, increasing the amount of flow that you experience in life, and we'll come back to this in a later chapter when we talk about positive psychology. One of the ways that you can increase your overall well-being and happiness in life is to experience flow more often. And the way that you experience flow more often is to do things that you love more often. So something to think about there. Okay, so no discussion of altered states of consciousness would be complete without at least mentioning the role that psychoactive drugs can play in this process. Now, I don't have a lot of time to talk about this, and I'm certainly not trying to glorify the use of illegal substances or legal substances. I'm kind of libertarian myself when it comes to my views of illicit drugs. You know, I personally think that we should take the approach that Portugal has taken. There's a TED talk about this that I wanted to play, we just don't have time. But in Portugal, they basically have legalized all drugs. And all the money that they were spending putting drug users in prison and jail, they are now spending on putting drug addicts in rehab facilities and putting them through college and training them and helping them better their lives. And guess what? Since they legalized all drugs, they decriminalized all drugs and put all the money into that program, guess what has happened in Portugal? Drug overdose deaths since they did that dropped by 90%. Drug overdose deaths in Portugal are 10% of what they used to be after all drugs got legalized. The war on drugs is a colossal waste of human resources, money, time, and human life. You know, just think about this. Right now, as we speak, if you've got a weed card, a Florida medical marijuana card, you can drive around the corner probably from where you live, somewhere in town, close to where you live, there's a dispensary, and you can go and buy a substance completely legally that people are sitting in prison as we speak for selling. Mostly people of color, by the way. So how screwed up is that, right? You can go to the store and buy it right now, today, if you've went and got your card, which I hear is pretty easy to do. I don't have personal experience with that. But you can go buy it legally at the store now while someone, as we speak, sits in prison for selling it, right? That's the upside down world that we live in this country with the world on the war on drugs. So I'm very libertarian about drug policy, even though an opioid drug overdose is what killed my dad, by the way. I may have mentioned that in the past. I lost my dad when I was 15 years old because of his addiction to opioid painkillers. That's what killed him. My dad would still be alive today if it weren't for opioid drugs. So you would think that I would be one of these crazy drugs are bad, we should keep them all illegal people, right? You would think that. No, I actually want the problems of drug addiction to be solved, not made worse. And that's the reason why I'm very libertarian when it comes to my views of the war on drugs. So that was my little soapbox speech on the war on drugs. I do want you guys to be familiar with the different classes of psychoactive drugs. I'm actually going to skip talking about them, but I want you to read about them. I want you to be familiar with the different classes like stimulants, hallucinogens, opiates, depressants, and the health effects of abuse of these various drugs, which you can read about in the chapter. I want you guys to be familiar with the concepts of addiction and tolerance, which are very real issues. Drug addiction and tolerance are real problems for a lot of people, and we need better treatments. Like I said, these issues need to be treated like medical problems, not moral failings. And again, that's just my strong position against the war on drugs. If you disagree with me on that, that's okay. But I think I've made my position on that pretty clear. So be familiar with the different types of psychoactive drugs. Be familiar with the concepts of addiction and tolerance and the concept of withdrawal. And I just don't have any time left to spend any more time in chapter 3 with you guys today. So we need to go ahead and get into what is happening to my screen here. Okay, there we go. We need to go ahead and get into chapter 5 at this point, and we have just enough time to do that. So we're here at 9. We're out at 9:15. It's 8:45. We've got half an hour, and I've got a 25-minute video to show you guys at this point to introduce chapter 5, our topic on sensation and perception. All right, so we're going to take a look at this video today for the remainder of the class period, and then I'm going to give my lecture on chapter 5 on Monday, and then on Wednesday we have our first exam. Okay, so let's take a look at this video at this point. And by the way, I just wanted to say from now on, I'm going to have to start taking questions at the beginning of the class meeting instead of at the end like I've been doing, because I found out on Monday that it takes some time to get out to Gulf Breeze right now with all the traffic on the Garcon Point Bridge, and I was very close to being late on Monday. So I'm going to have to end the class meeting on time from now on because of the traffic situation. So I'm really going to try to make a habit of starting the class meeting maybe around 7:50, 7:55. So folks who really need to talk to me at length about something, we can do that before class, because I need to get out of my house and to Gulf Breeze like really the second class is over, so I'm not late. Okay, so let's watch the video and then we'll call it a day. And I won't have time to take questions after class today, but I will be checking my email this afternoon. So I'll just starting class 5 to 10 minutes earlier, starting on Monday is what I'm going to do. And in the meantime, you can just email me if you have anything that's pressing. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look without further ado.
Annenberg Media.
How is our brain tricked by visual illusions? What makes a star quarterback misjudge an easy pass? Why does this rotating square appear to expand and contract? Sensation and perception, this time on Discovering Psychology. Lights, camera, perception. When you were little and some big kids pushed you around, did you ever fantasize about becoming bigger all of a sudden? Well, I did, and now I can, at the Exploratorium, San Francisco's Science Museum. How did I do it? The easy way, by manipulating your perception. When you first saw me, I appeared to be normal size, because you couldn't see the rest of the room. But as the lights came up and the camera pulled back, your brain performed a new instantaneous analysis. It now saw me as small. It added up all the visual information it had about my size and the size and shape of the room. And then it added in everything it knew from experience about the usual shape of rooms, that they're rectangular and have right angles. So when I walked over here, your brain was convinced I was growing incredibly large because there was no other perceptual explanation, even though it wasn't logical. Let's look at it again, only this time from a different perspective. The room is not rectangular at all. It's totally distorted. There are no right angles anywhere. So that makes this clock, which is large and oval, look the same as that clock, which is small and circular, from your other perspective. The floor slopes upward, and as you can see, the ceiling slopes downward. So I'm not getting larger at all. You're just misperceiving my size because you think that you're the same distance from me when I'm over here as you are from me when I'm over there. But in fact, I'm twice as far away. It's always more fun to have a vivid example of misperception. But the truth is, our perception is usually very accurate. It has to be. We couldn't survive if it weren't. Perception is our way of making contact with our environment, of discovering what's happening outside our body and our brain. All species have developed special sensory apparatus to gather information essential for survival. Eagles and other birds of prey have astonishingly accurate vision. Dogs can smell things in concentrations 100 times lower than we can. And bats can use sonar to track and capture tiny, fast-moving insects. Psychologists study all sensory processes, hearing, smell, taste, and so on. But their major focus, and ours, is on visual perception. Our sensory abilities are usually measured by the absolute threshold, the weakest level of a stimulus that can be accurately detected at least half the time. For humans, that includes a candle flame seen at 30 miles on a dark, clear night. The tick of a watch under quiet conditions at 20 feet. 1 teaspoon of sugar in 2 gallons of water. 1 drop of perfume diffused in the space of a 3-room apartment. The wing of a bee falling on your cheek from a distance of 1 centimeter. Our sensory knowledge of these stimuli comes from the many millions of specialized receptors spread throughout our bodies. In our eyes, ears, nose, tongue, skin, muscles, our joints and tendons, our inner ear, and even certain parts of our digestive tract. Each receptor is designed to detect certain types of physical energy, such as light waves or sound waves. This stimulation is then converted into a special code, electrochemical signals called neural impulses, which the nervous system transmits to the brain's cortex. The cortex has the job of putting all the sensory information together and acting upon it. Different regions of the cortex translate different neural impulses into different psychological experiences, such as melody or touch. Visual information is first processed in the occipital lobe area in the rear of the brain, hearing and smell in the temporal lobe, speech perception in the frontal lobe, and body senses in the parietal lobe. These primary sensory centers then project the results of their activity to a relay station, the thalamus, which in turn sends the information to a succession of areas in the cortex. It's believed that this is where more abstract information processing takes place, and where we connect new information with old information stored in our memory. Visual perception, for instance, takes place in 3 areas: in the retina, or the back surface of the eye, in the pathways through the brain, and in the part of the cortex at the back of the brain responsible for visual processing, the visual cortex. This is the way an image, or rather a pattern of stimulation, is formed on the retina. It's upside down, flat, distorted, full of holes, out of focus, and obscured by blood vessels. In fact, it's amazing that we see as well as we do. Now remember that the task of all perception is to determine what the real object in the environment is. Another term for this object is the distal stimulus, the thing out there. But the only way to find out what that is by using information derived from the object's stimulation of a sensory receptor in the body. This stimulation is called the proximal stimulus. In this case, an image formed on the retina. The brain knows only the image, but what it must discover is the true nature of the actual object, the distal stimulus. So here's where the brain earns its keep. It must eliminate confusing signals, fill in the blanks, give it 3 dimensions, and straighten out the upside-down image to put it all in perspective. These transformations occur instantly and continually. David Hubel of Harvard won a Nobel Prize with his colleague Torsten Wiesel for mapping the action of receptor cells along the visual path of a primate, from the retina to the cortex.
Receptor cells usually in the visual pathway mean the cells that take in the energy and turn it into electrical signals. And in the retina, those are the rods and cones. There are 125 million rods and cones in each retina. So in the case of the visual pathway, you start with the retina. The output is the optic nerve, which contains 1 million fibers. They end up in a certain region in the brain. That region, or there are really 2 or 3 regions that they end up in, each of those sends a cable of fibers of the order of maybe 1 million to other regions, and they connect to other regions. And in the case of the cortex, you have separate areas of cortex, each one connected to 1 or more other areas. And this whole thing is a pathway. In the cortex, for example, the primary visual cortex, which is about 7 stages beyond the receptors in the retina, those cells react to visual stimuli only if a line falls on the retina, and the line has to be a particular orientation. It can be a bright line or a dark line or an edge between bright and light. Any kind of line really generally works, but the position of the line and the orientation are terribly important, and if they're not just right, any individual cell doesn't respond.
In this experimental footage, a bright vertical line stimulates a small number of neurons in the visual cortex of a cat. The crackling sound is the electrical activity of these neurons as they respond to this retinal image. By listening to the intensity of this electrical activity, the researchers can determine the correct orientation of the line. But when the line is moved to a diagonal or horizontal position, the amount of stimulation decreases dramatically.
We're only at a very elementary stage when it comes to understanding something like how you recognize a face or something like that. The general region of the brain is known where things like that go on, but we don't have the slightest idea what's happening at the level of single cells for that particular problem. But for more elementary problems, for the very first processes of vision, we do have a very good understanding of what happens at the very beginning. So it's just a start.
Misha Pavel of Stanford University is studying the successive stages of information processing that take place continually as we perceive the world. Using computer graphics, he has demonstrated how the visual system breaks down visual stimulation into millions of bits of information and recombines them into a coherent image that we recognize.
Seeing something seems such an effortless activity that it's hard to imagine for us the complexities and difficulties that are involved. Only when you try to build a robot that can actually see and recognize objects do you realize how complicated task this is. People must do an awful lot of processing in order to see images and interpret them. Here is an image of a cat as our eye and brain sees it. Now let's look at what the visual system goes through to enable us to see this image. When the light first reaches the retina, the image is slightly defocused by the optics of the eye. Then it is broken up into millions of little pieces. Each receptor sees just a minuscule portion of the original image and measures its brightness. Different receptors in the retina are sensitive to different colors of light and respond to the amount of that color that they see. To discover objects, the visual system tries to find important boundaries. It uses edge and line detecting neurons, whose characteristics have been investigated by Hubel and Wiesel. Here you can see the results of the red, green, and blue edge detectors. Look at the blue edges. It is hard to believe that there is a cat in there. What I'd like to show you now is the kind of information that the brain uses in order to make sense out of these messy images. The things that the brain seems to look for are constancies and simplicity. Imagine that you are in your visual system looking at this pattern of active neurons. But you can't recognize the pattern. We can see it now because all the points in the cat picture move together. This is an example of the brain using rigidity to recognize moving objects. Ambiguous perception of motion can actually destroy the rigidity percept. In this case, we have a rotating rigid object, a square, but when its corners disappear from view, the square appears to get smaller. When the corners reappear, it gets larger. Another example. We thought that the square loses its rigidity because the visual neurons at each location can see only a small proportion of the entire picture and therefore can't accurately perceive the direction of the moving parts of the object. If we rotate the cross, then the stationary square appears to be rigid. We can simultaneously compare these two situations. The conclusion is that the motion of the square is necessary to lose rigidity. The failure of rigidity in this case helps scientists to study how information from different retinal locations is combined to form a single percept. This is one of many examples where perceptual phenomena can reveal how our brain works.
Every moment, the brain must make an endless number of perceptual decisions. It has to compute size and distance relationships, determine where boundaries and edges exist, identify figures within backgrounds, move us toward objects we want and away from objects we need to avoid. Many of these perceptual decisions are made without any conscious awareness of the processes involved. The brain is automatically computing the sensory feedback and guiding the body to perform the necessary tasks. When a quarterback sees a receiver, for instance, he automatically, unconsciously calculates distance, angle, and velocity, and the muscles in his hand, arm, and shoulder adjust accordingly. But what if we distort his perception of the receiver? These glasses will displace his visual field by 20 degrees. In other words, the distal stimulus, the real object, will be 20 degrees off from where he perceives it to be. If he continues to pass with the glasses on, he'll begin to adapt to the new signals by compensating for the misinformation his retina is sending to his brain. He'll start throwing what seems to him to be 20 degrees off in order to hit the receiver. He has quickly learned a new arm-eye coordination. But return his vision to normal, and he'll start missing again, in the opposite direction. Even though his retina is now passing on accurate information about the true location of the target, his brain hasn't caught up with the new input. His brain is still compensating for the previous feedback from the movements in his hand and arm. Getting accurate information about the world around us, and not just the images on a retina, is the major task of our visual system. But to sense, perceive, and understand our world, we utilize two very different processes. First, our sensory receptors detect external stimulation and send this raw data to the brain for analysis. We call this bottom-up processing. Then top-down processing enters the scene. It adds what we already know about such stimulation, what we remember about the context in which it usually appears, and how we label and classify it. In this way, we give meaning to our perceptions. When people walk towards us, we know that they're not getting larger, even though the image they cast on the retina does get larger. And if a shadow falls on our newspaper, we know the paper isn't turning darker. That's because the hallmark of perception is our ability to impose stability on the constantly changing flow of sensations we experience. Psychologists refer to this phenomenon as perceptual constancy. The actual size, shape, orientation, and brightness of an object are perceived as remaining relatively constant, even when there are extreme variations in the image it projects. What we perceive is not just a passive photograph of reality, but an active construction of reality. We tend to see what we expect to see. We see things with our minds as well as our eyes. We are constantly selecting only a small part of the available sensory information to attend to and process. One of the ways we perceive something actively is by taking into account its context. This context can even determine the nature of the perception itself, with the same object looking very different in different contexts. Take a look at this square. Notice how the square appears to get darker as the background becomes lighter, or in other words, as the context changes. Now take a look at these three men. We see the figure on the right as smaller than the one on the left, in back, because we unconsciously compare him with the large figure. But in fact, the two small figures are exactly the same size. To be effective, perception also has to work fast and extract the minimal amount of information necessary to form an impression of the entire pattern. Visual perception would be far too slow if we had to wait to experience every last piece of something. Edges and boundaries in particular convey lots of information about an object. They provide a visual shortcut which can help the brain fill in the whole pattern from the fewest identifying parts. Sometimes the brain will even register a pattern that doesn't exist. These phantom patterns are called subjective contours. A boundary or an edge can powerfully influence the way we see things. In this example, the left half of the screen appears darker than the right half. But watch what happens when we cover up the boundary. What happened is this. Your brain detected a slight difference in brightness in the center, and then went overboard in extending that difference to the rest of the surface. Given the complexity of the world we try to understand, and the complexity of our minds, it's small wonder that what we perceive as out there is subject to a great number of influences, some of which will lead us astray. We may see something that isn't there because it's what we expect to see. Or conversely, we may not see something because we don't expect to see it. Our previous experience, our expectations, interests, and biases are constantly giving rise to different perceptions. Let's take a look at this illustration. Some of you will see a young woman, and some of you will see an old woman. In various studies, it was found that younger people tended to see the younger face, while older people tended to see the older face, without any hints about what to look for. And then there's the rat man illusion. Try to identify each drawing as soon as you see it. Now, identify this one. Let's try another sequence. Again, identify each drawing as soon as you see it. Now, how about this one? In a number of studies, it was found that the first series of drawings of animals led most subjects to identify this image as a rat. But when other subjects saw the drawings of people, they tended to identify this drawing as an old man with glasses. Their prior experiences created very different ways of looking at the same distal stimulus. Sometimes, however, we have trouble perceiving things not because of our experiences or our expectations, but just the opposite. There's just too much unfamiliar information to absorb. We're taken by surprise. But surprise is what often happens to eyewitnesses. Watch this simulated bank robbery again and try to tell who did what. Who shot whom? Would you swear to it in court? Let's show the film this time in slow motion to see if you were right. The hand, the arm, even the whole body can be quicker than the eye when the brain isn't ready to do its detective work. What happens when we have no trouble seeing something, but what we see just doesn't make sense? When we encounter a visual paradox. At first glance, this is a solid wooden triangle. But it can't be a triangle because from my perspective it has two right angles, and that's impossible. So impossible, I want you to watch this as I slice my arm right through without breaking it. So now you know that it can't be solid either. Changing the perspective enables you to see it as it really is. We call this way of seeing an object in terms of its parts the analytic way of seeing, which conflicts with the holistic way of seeing the big picture. Either view makes sense alone, but together, they create a paradox. In this animation of a bouncing ball, the staircase appears to go up forever. This paradox also works in reverse. Although our senses put us in touch with the world around us, it's our brain, working from prior experiences, that tells us whether something is impossible or possible, organizing our perceptions and telling us what's out there and what we should think about it. And so each of us has incredibly sophisticated hardware in the form of sensory apparatus and software to process the information and make sense of it, both perfected over millions of years. Usually the two work together extremely well, but sometimes they don't. And so we can never take perception for granted, no matter how well we do it in the normal course of our lives. In our next program, we're going to look at another ability of ours that shapes the way we look at the world, and that's our ability to learn.
Okay, guys, that's it for today. If anybody needs to follow up with me about anything, I will be checking my email later this afternoon. I got to get out to Gulf Breeze now. I'm going to be lecturing the entire class period on Monday. We've got just about the right amount of time to cover what I need to cover in the lecture on Monday before we have our exam on Wednesday. Okay, so I'll be following up on my emails later for any folks who have any questions for me. I apologize that I can't hang out after class. Like I said, I will be starting class meetings a few minutes earlier from here on out for folks who need to chat with me. So I'll see you guys on Monday. Have a great weekend. Live long and prosper. All right.